Cute little photo up there. I got asked a couple of times if I was bringing my dog Bear to the conference. She's a little bit of a celebrity, so she does have a bit of a Facebook following and on my social media stuff. So no, I did not bring Bear. I keep joking with Janice Bunting, if she brings NWA to the Shenandoah Valley, maybe I'll bring Bear one time. So I want to talk to you about learning from weather history, and I'll give you a little bit of a background on me and how I got into weather. It's kind of an eclectic story. We all have a past. We all have usually an event of how we got into weather. We all have our story. And unlike a lot of people, you can kind of trace it back maybe to a childhood or to an event when you were younger. I kind of got into weather a little bit later in life. So my story actually starts with the big pepper. I was a chili head for 12 years. Worked at Chili's for a long time. I had a lot of sizzle in my step, you could say. In fact, I actually opened the Chili's in Starkville. And I believe, if I remember, that was in 2004. That was before I even was thinking about weather as a career. I was the host trainer. That was my host team. I heard that the Chili's is no more, but I was a part of that, and I had been to Starkville before I even came to Mississippi State to get my degree. So while I was at Chili's, I was part of a training team, and we would travel around and open new restaurants, which is how I got to come to Starkville. So I did a lot of these openings, and I started training and doing these openings in 2003. Think weather-wise, what happened the next year in 2004? And what happened the next year in 2005? Oh yeah, it was a big hurricane year. So I put chili peppers where I was during Gene and Francis. Got caught up in a couple of hurricanes then. And then in 2005, well, they sent me to Louisiana. Of course they did, right? So at this point, they're joking that I'm a hurricane magnet. And then I ended up going back to Slidell and Mandeville to help retrain the two stores and help kind of put together the two stores after a lot of the employees had left and all that good stuff. So I stayed in Louisiana, supposed to be 2 weeks, ended up being almost 3 months. So at that point, you know, all of these storms, I'm starting to think, what do I want to do? What do I want to do? I don't want to be in a cubicle from 9 to 5. I can't do that. Maybe I should start thinking about weather. So I had a plan that once I got home from Louisiana, eventually, I was going to contact my local chief meteorologist. I was living in East Tennessee at the time, and I was going to ask him about weather opportunities. What can I do with weather? What kind of jobs are out there? I did not like science growing up, but I loved math. I was good at math. I could do the math. Maybe I could learn the science. Before I could get home, I was sent to Madison, Mississippi, where I proceeded to be in a tornado warning the day after we opened the Chili's. The chili pepper is where the Chili's was. The opening was actually such a big deal in Madison, and this was the day after the opening, that someone from the TV station knew that there were 20-something trainers from all over the country at this restaurant in the middle of this tornado warning, and they called us and told us to get into shelter. The first time I ever saw the sky turn green. There was actually no confirmed tornado, but when I was putting together this presentation, it's the first time I actually looked up the SPC reports. And you can see no confirmed tornadoes in Mississippi at the time, but it was quite the big severe weather day. And that was in November of 2005. So I was sent home around the holidays, finally talked to Mark Reynolds at WHSV in Johnson City, Tennessee. He brought me in, and I start asking him about weather opportunities. What can I do behind the scenes? Thinking weather producing, building graphics. I'm good with computers. He said, no, there's no jobs for that. You need to get into TV. I'm not a TV person. I was not to be on camera. No way. He said, he told me 3 things. He said, you've got the voice for it, you can do it, and I want you to take a look at this program. And he showed me the Mississippi State Distance Learning Program, because I was still traveling with Chili's at the time, and I was able to work ahead and kind of figure my schedule out and still travel while I did this program. So Mark was the whole reason of why I got into weather. It took one person to give me that encouragement, that spirit, that spark that I needed to get into this field. I'd never been on camera before. I never touched a camera. But the leadership qualities that I learned, well, I was a chili head because I had sizzle. I could talk to a classroom of Chili's employees and teach them everything there was to know about Chili's. And that's what gave me the confidence to talk in front of the camera. Now, obviously all of us are nervous at first, but Chili's gave me the fundamentals and those leadership qualities that I used for television that I could actually be on TV. And it's amazing. If you had told me when I was 20 years old, you know, in 15 years, you're going to be a chief meteorologist at a TV station in Virginia, and you're going to be giving a keynote speech back at your school in Mississippi State, I would have thought you were crazy. And a lot of that is thanks to Mark Reynolds. So I owe him a lot. After that, I decided to try to find my first job. And that took a little while. But I finally got a job in the Shenandoah Valley at WHSV. This is a view of the Shenandoah Valley. We're on the western side of Virginia, right up I-81, kind of along the Virginia-West Virginia border. I started in 2010 as a weekend meteorologist, like many of us started in our career, like many of you students will start in your career as a weekend meteorologist. Like I said, I never touched a camera, but I was willing to learn. I remember walking around when I was training, I didn't even know what a VOSA and a package was. But I took notes, and you better believe I Googled everything every night when I went home. And I found out, and I learned quick, and I worked hard because I wanted this, and I didn't want to fail, and I wanted to do a good job. So I worked as hard as I could, and I tried to learn as much as I could because I had that passion and that drive. And that's what got me to where I am today. So, over time, this fire for weather that still continued to grow grew into this love of weather history. I started when I was out doing reports, and there was a number of non-weather stories that you do when you're reporting as a weekend meteorologist. And there's a lot of people that you would meet. And I started talking to people about the past storms and past events that have affected the Shenandoah Valley. I don't live in a severe weather market, but you better believe there have been some big events that have shaped the Shenandoah Valley, and a lot of big weather events, and a lot of people that still remember those events. So I started diving into the weather history of the Shenandoah Valley and was quite surprised at a lot of the events that I found. So I encourage you, either at your stations now or for our students, when you get your TV jobs, dive into the weather of your market. Not only will it make you a better forecaster because you're learning about these past weather events, but it builds a relationship with the community. And you'll be surprised to find out when people realize you've taken the time to learn about these past events, the events that have shaped your community, their community, they're going to trust you more. And they're going to give you more information. They're going to talk to you. And they're going to share their story with you. So when you learn the past weather of your area, think about the big storms. What are the big events that have shaped maybe a lot of policies and procedures, maybe the flood mitigation plans? What's changed over the years because of these past large storms? What are the ones that 50, 60 years later people remember? What are the ones that people tell their children over decades? What are the big weather myths? I'll tell you the two in my area, and you'll laugh at one of them. I live in a valley in between two large mountains, and one of the big weather myths is tornadoes don't happen in mountains. Well, we all know that's not true.
Right.
The second weather myth, and I have no idea where this came from, is that if a tornado were to get in, it would ping pong in between the mountains and not be able to get out. See, I told you would laugh. I have no idea where that came from, but I still get asked that question. So I work to educate my viewers to debunk those myths, so they're not caught off guard. I didn't know a tornado could happen in the mountains. Well, they might not happen as often, but they do. In fact, speaking of April 27, 28, 2011, we had 5 tornadoes in the Shenandoah Valley between midnight and 4 a.m. Midnight and 4 a.m. in the Shenandoah Valley. One traveled 33 miles. Still blows my mind to this day. That was quite incredible. What kind of weather are people sensitive to? You guys live down here in Tornado Alley. What about Lee County? What kind of weather do you think they're really sensitive to right now? What about the Panhandle of Florida? What do you think they're really sensitive to right now after Hurricane Michael? I don't live in a severe weather area. I have to be very careful when we talk about the potential for tornadoes, because that big T word scares people. So I have to kind of dance around it, but still let people know when there's that potential there, and still say it, but yet work to not scare them. After the big derecho of 2012, that went through the Ohio Valley, winds 70, 80, 90 miles an hour all the way to DC. You know, the big question was, does it make it over the mountains? Well, the moral of the story is that when it's 105 degrees that day and your dew points are 70, anything makes it over the mountains. And for months afterwards, anything that would pop up on radar, you get a phone call. NWS would get a phone call. Is it another derecho? Is it another derecho? You know, and you think about these sensitivities, you know, and that all goes back to these past events. So just to give you a little topography lesson, a little geography on the Shenandoah Valley, beautiful area. It's all part of the Appalachian Mountain chain. We have the Blue Ridge Mountains on the east, which also includes the Shenandoah National Park, if you've heard of the Shenandoah National Park. To our west, along the West Virginia border, are the Allegheny Mountains. These mountains can range between 400 and 4,900 feet typically. So I want to talk to you first about a flood that none of you have ever heard of. This one is the 1949 flood in Augusta County, Virginia. And the big lesson here is because of this flood, it helped shape a lot of our flood mitigation plans. In fact, there was actually another flood a few years before this, so it was kind of the combination of the two that helped shape a lot of the flood mitigation plans for the area. That once I started learning about this flood, I realized how much flood mitigation was based off of this one event. So I'm going to tell you about a little town called Stokesville, Virginia. No one's ever heard of it, that's okay. Most of it's unfortunately not there anymore. Stokesville, Virginia sits in the Shenandoah Valley, and this is actually the location of Stokesville. You can see it sits along a river, the North River, and the gap between two ridges. The mountaintops to the west, along the Virginia-West Virginia border, are up about 4,600 to 4,800 feet high. You can see the problem already setting up. So in 1949, this is a picture of Stokesville. It was a railroad boom town, your typical 1940s boom town. It sits on the western edge of the Shenandoah Valley, right before you get to the high mountains. The population at the time was about 1,500 people, and the main industry was lumber. Because it sits at the base of a ridge, what happened during the late 1800s and the early 1900s is they used to set a number of fires up on the mountain, it's called Shenandoah Mountain, And they would also strip all of the timber from the mountain. They would take all that lumber, process all that lumber through the mill. So the mountainside, at this time in 1949, after several decades of clearing the mountain, was stripped. Think about our California burn scars. You can already picture in your mind the setup already. Yeah, there it is. 1949 in June. This is the surface map. So the synoptic setup, we had a large ridge of high pressure over the Atlantic, and we had a tropical low moving from Florida to Georgia. Officially, I don't think it was a named storm. This was just unorganized tropical low, lots of tropical moisture. It had been raining for several days. It had been a previously pretty wet summer. Then we have a cold front that was moving very slow. We all know a lot of times in the summer things don't move very fast. This cold front was slowing down and would ultimately stall over the mountains. There was also an upper level low over the Ohio Valley. Don't forget, we also have mountains. So now we have to incorporate orographic lift. Eastern slopes of the mountains in the Shenandoah Valley with the tropical moisture, deep layer of moisture in place. It had been raining for 3 days. So on the third day is when we get the remnants of that tropical low, the uplift from that stalling out cold front, and you get that enhanced lift. The USGS report said that there was actually not even enough rainfall reports to make an isohyto map. They could later estimate from the debris flow that the rainfall could be between 10 and 15 inches. And you can kind of see how sporadic it was. Stokesville at the base of the mountain, now there was one dam on the ridge at the time, and that recorded almost 10 inches in the 3 days. Harrisonburg, which is basically where I live, down the road from Stokesville, maybe 30 miles, 2.5 inches. Quite the difference. There's a river that flows from Stokesville to Bridgewater, because that water's got to go somewhere. So think on the mountaintops, 10 to 15 inches of rain flowing all the way down the bare mountainsides. Exactly. Mudslides and debris flows. Now the one thing that likely saved a lot of people's lives here was that it started in the afternoon, daylight. It started thunderstorming, late morning into the afternoon. The rain got heavier and heavier after it had already been raining for several days. And that heavy rain on the bare mountainsides led to numerous mudslides. There was about 75 to 80 mudslides in this very small confined area. And you saw on the map where Stokesville was, in a little gap. So all of that mud and rain and debris went right into the path of least resistance, into Stokesville. Now, a lot of people did not actually try to leave their homes, thankfully. That also saved a lot of lives. They went to the top, second story of their home. What happened, and this is what later killed people, is because the river ran from Stokesville to Bridgewater, by the time the river started to rise in Bridgewater, it was almost dark, 7, 8 o'clock at night. Well, Bridgewater didn't receive a lot of rain. You saw the difference in rainfall. They had not had a lot of rain. So all of a sudden, the river is rising substantially, and it's rising quickly. So people in Bridgewater were caught off guard. Where's this water coming from? We haven't had that much rain. People all of a sudden started to be washed away because it was a warm summer night. A lot of people were out. Several people were washed away. Many were able to cling to trees. Unfortunately, 3 people did die. It's a miracle that no one died in Stokesville. The top picture on the left is what the mountain looked like prior to 1949, with all the trees down, the trees stripped, and then the current picture of Shenandoah Mountain today. It is lush, it is green, it is a protected area. The church in Stokesville, I was out there a couple weeks ago. That church in downtown Stokesville was the only building left standing. The reports are that the water parted on either side. There's no geographic topography reason why that church should be the only building left standing. It's quite incredible. But that's what the town looks like today. That's it. There's nothing left. Because all the topsoil was washed away, this is going to be our issue across the Mississippi River Valley and in Iowa and Nebraska. That's where all your nutrients are. In Virginia, we're a very big agriculture area. So now you have a town washed away and all the topsoil is washed away. So the town basically died because there was nothing left. The farmers couldn't continue to grow their crops in this area. At the time of the flood, there was one dam on the mountain. After the flood, 10 more were built in the years later. It took about 15 years to build all of those, but this led to 10 more dams being built. So when we had other big events in the following years, especially from our big remnant tropical systems, this saved countless lives. Unfortunately, 3 people had to die. But can you imagine if the flood of 1949 hadn't happened and something bigger down the road would have happened? We would have lost a lot more people. So this is why we have a lot of our flood mitigation. And it's because of weather history and learning the history of the area. Next, I want to talk about 1996. 1996 in the Shenandoah Valley was a very interesting year. And because I had already previously studied 1996, when last year happened, after we picked up record rainfall in May and record rainfall in June, my immediate thought was, this is so much like 1996. 1996 started in January with so much snow, and then we had so much heavy rain, it ended up being the second wettest year on record until last year. Now it's number 3. So the big blizzard of 1996, yeah, 2 to 3 feet plus snow right at the beginning of January across the mid-Atlantic. Then after that, we had a lot of rain on top of a lot of snow melt. Our January liquid was 5 to 8 inches of liquid, which was the wettest for most of our weather stations and a lot of Virginia. So we started off with a bang. Then we went into spring and continued with the rain, and we had above average rainfall and numerous thunderstorms in May, June, July, and August. Continuous flooding almost since the beginning of the year. And then what happened in September of 1996? Yeah. So you could feel my fear last June after we picked up 20 inches of rain in 2 months. I'm thinking, here we go, 1996, hurricane season. This could be bad. Hurricane Fran struck southern North Carolina and moved into Virginia. This ended up producing catastrophic flooding across Virginia. Here's the WPC rainfall estimates with a track. Big Meadows is up in the Shenandoah National Park, about 3,000 feet-ish, 16 inches of rain. Luray sits just at the base of the mountain. That water's going to run somewhere. This is the football goalpost, 16 feet high. That's how high the water was. Widespread rainfall of 5 to 10 inches with some locally higher amounts, upwards of 12. And then, of course, our max. In Rockingham County, which is where Harrisonburg is, more than 10,000 people had to be evacuated from their homes. This was a huge flooding event, and it started at the beginning of the year. It was a ripple effect that didn't stop, much like last year. As a result of Fran, more flood mitigation was put into place. So the local governments, local emergency managers moved some homes. They bought some homes and some land. Businesses restructured some things, moved basements above flood stage. They were able to work with FEMA to look at some flood inundation maps And also, a lot of swift water rescue teams were started because of this storm. We were also one of the first counties in the state of Virginia to start the shelters that were able to include animals. So now, when we have these big disasters, you have certain shelters that are able to accept animals because of this flood. So 2018, well, we didn't have a big snowstorm in 2018. It didn't start like 1996. May started very dry. In fact, I made a comment at the very beginning of May, because we actually had wet Mays in 2017 and 2016. And I made a comment the first week of May, and I said, maybe we'll get away with a dry May. Inches. Technically, we're in a rain shadow because of the mountains, so we actually average a lot less than surrounding areas in the South and the Mid-Atlantic. So, and parts of our mountain areas picked up almost as much rain as Wilmington, North Carolina. It was incredible. We did get a little effect from Hurricane Michael. It became more of a river flooding event. We had 3 to 5 inches, and our rivers completely flooded because we had rain. I think we had rain for like 9 days. It could have been a lot worse. This was nerve-wracking for the entire rest of the year because I knew in the back of my mind about 1996. A lot of people remembered 1996. And when we would interview them, they would say, the last time I saw something like this was 1996. Few people said, I've lived here for all my life and I've never seen anything like it. And then I would ask them, what about 1996? Oh, I forgot about 1996. Yeah, I guess 1996 was pretty bad. Yeah, it was. It was bad everywhere across the entire area. Now I want to get to Hurricane Camille. I want to talk about the Virginia part of Camille. The forgotten part of the storm. You all are here on the Gulf Coast. A lot of you grew up in this area. A lot of you have heard about Hurricane Camille. But I want to talk about the Virginia part of Camille. Camille was one of the worst storms ever to hit the U.S. Category 5, you all know the story. Category 5 on the Gulf Coast moved inland into Kentucky. Then it moved almost due west to east, striking Virginia in the middle of the night. Let me introduce you to Nelson County. Nelson County in 1969, a very quiet mountain community. The population at the time for the whole county was about 11,000 people. If you've ever heard of the show The Waltons, the creator of The Waltons was from Nelson County. He based a lot of the show on Nelson County. So if you've ever watched the show, that's pretty much what Nelson County is. It's a beautiful county. Hurricane Camille destroyed Nelson County. Here's the WPC map of Nelson County with the track and the rainfall max. And they list 2 rainfall maxes, one for Mississippi and the 27 inches. That's the verified report. There's some unverified reports of 30 to 40 inches. And you can see the track and the parallel rainfall max along the mountains. 143 deaths along the Gulf Coast. There were more in Virginia. Comparable, 153 deaths in Virginia. The majority of those were in Nelson County, and 33 people have never been found. It wasn't the rain, it was the mud. Most people did not drown. Most people were buried in mud. This was not a Katrina, people drown thing. People died in mud. This was a horrific event in Virginia. The historical marker, it's close, but it could use a little updating. 124 people died in Nelson County. So out of the 153 people in Virginia, 104 people died in one county. That's 1% of the county's population. 1% died that night. As I mentioned, the 27-inch rainfall max per WPC, and it rained for about 7 to 8 hours. 7 to 8 hours. That's a shift. That's a shift while you're at work. Davis Creek, which sits at the base, pretty close to the base of Wintergreen Mountain, was the hardest hit, and there were some rainfall estimates that were near 40 inches. 52 people were killed in Davis Creek. 52 people in one community. I've talked to a lot of survivors, and I have to be really sensitive. This year marked 50 years. It's still very, very hard for a lot of people to talk about. A lot of people who I talked to said they didn't even know a hurricane was striking the Gulf Coast. This was 1969. The heaviest of the rain started between about 7, 8 o'clock at night and continued through around 3, 4 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday night. Here's the kicker, and I did not know this until, and I had looked at Camille for years. I did not know this until last year. This is a picture from Harrisonburg of flooding waters. In July of 1969, before the storm, most of our weather stations recorded 10 to 15 inches widespread in the weeks before Hurricane Camille. Because my emergency manager in Harrisonburg said, hey, I have a picture of flooding from Hurricane Camille. I said, Harrisonburg didn't flood during Camille. He said, it's from the summer of 1969. So last year I did a little research. 13 inches in Harrisonburg during the month of July. So then I started looking in Nelson County. The Tye River, which is one of the main rivers in Nelson County, reported 11 inches in the month of July, just weeks before Hurricane Camille. So when Camille started that night, not only do we have saturated soils, we have rich tropical moisture that's already in place. And dew points. Let me tell you about Virginia dew points. When it's over 60 in Virginia, that's humid. When it's over 65 in Virginia, that's a big deal. That's a big deal. That's nothing for you guys. When it's over 65 in Virginia, it's a big deal, especially on our side of the state with the Blue Ridge Mountains. Now, east a little bit toward Richmond, D.C., they get humid. We don't get humid on our side. So with dew points in the upper 60s, near 70, that's a huge deal for the Blue Ridge Mountains. So on the night of August 19th, 1969, it started raining, 7, 8 o'clock at night. And you have to think, mountainous community. Not only there's 3 river gauges in Nelson County, but there's lots and lots and lots of creeks. And a lot of people live along these creeks. And they started rising quickly. It did not take long for the rain to become so heavy, it was described as a waterfall. Birds drowned in trees. It was so heavy when people tried to escape and tried to make it to higher ground, they had to hold their hands over their face to breathe. This is rainfall that had never been recorded like this in U.S. history. It's rainfall that most of us would never ever see the intensity of in our lifetime. This is how anomalous this event was. Because of the already saturated soils and 30 inches of rain in 6 to 8 hours, it led to more than 3,800 debris flows in Nelson County. And there were about, I think, 1,800 debris flows in a county in West Virginia, too. 3,800 debris flows in Nelson County. So the synoptic setup, other than we have a remnant tropical system, because Camille was a depression. Camille was weakening. But here's the thing, Camille was picked up by the jet. And a lot of the literature, it says that Camille met up with a stalling cold front. It wasn't a stalling cold front. We had a remnant tropical low and a cold front moving from north to south. Camille met up with a jet streak. That jet streak intensified that rain. You have abundant low-level moisture already in place. And now you had mountains, eastern slopes of the mountains, orographic lift. It's a recipe for disaster. It's like the aviation experts say when it comes to plane crashes. It's usually not one thing, it's a series of events This is a series of events. This is a bad series of events. And when you factor in that jet streak, that changed the game. There's 2 max rainfalls between 20 and 25 inches. This wasn't just a tiny little area like in 1949. This was a large, widespread area. We had a 40 to 60 mile an hour, or 40 to 60 mile swath of training thunderstorms with deep moisture convection for 6 to 7 hours in the middle of the night. Think about it. 1969. How are we going to alert people? Well, let's talk about radar in 1969. Let me tell you, radar in Virginia, where I live in the Shenandoah Valley, is not so pretty now. So in 1969, with a WSR-57, they couldn't see anything. They couldn't see anything. It was 120 miles away from Nelson County. They have since moved the radar site to Sterling, which is about 25 miles to the west. There was no other radar coverage in western or central Virginia. Oh, and the WSR-57 was the new and improved version. That was the modern radar at the time. Richmond had an old WSR-3 radar with limited power. Pittsburgh was 200 miles away. They couldn't hardly see anything. All right, I'm going to cry at the end of this. So I put up text. I'll be fine. But it's an important story I want you to hear. Warren Raines, if you've ever read Roar of the Heavens, his story is in that book, his full story. If you haven't, Roar of the Heavens is a very good book that not only goes through the Gulf Coast, but also the Virginia part of Hurricane Camille. So a lot of people tried to leave their homes in the middle of the night in search of higher ground. It did not take long for the heavy rain to become so destructive. It only took about 2 hours or so to cut off communication. And we'll talk about that part in just a second. But many people tried to leave their home to find higher ground. So this is Warren Raines. He had a brother, Carl. Warren was 14 at the time. They lived in Massey's Mill near the Tye River. Massey's Mill was one of the slightly larger communities of Nelson County. Their parents, they had another brother and 2 sisters. And also, I believe there were 3 or 4 neighbor kids that had come over with them. After midnight, they tried to leave in their car. The car wouldn't start. So they tried to walk to higher ground. It didn't take long for 2 feet of water to become 4 feet of water. You have a lot of children here. They all became basically washed away. Warren and his brother Carl were able to cling to a willow tree and survive the night in the willow tree. Out of the other 4 kids that had come over, 2 of them also survived in a tree all night. Here's the bad part. Search of his family, the home only had about 5 feet of water in it. If they had escaped to the 2nd level of their home, everyone would have survived. That's tough. That's a tough story. Another survivor I just met is Iris and Milton. Iris was 6 at the time, Milton was 17. They lived in Livingston, which is now the county seat, and that's near Muddy Creek. So when the rain started after about 7, 8 o'clock, their dad was pacing by the window, watching the water come up. The creek had never been that high. All of a sudden it comes to the doorsteps of their home. Their thought, we've got to get to higher ground. The church is on higher ground. We've got to get to the church. Church is 4 to 5 miles down the road. So their plan was to get in the car, go get their grandparents, and go down to the church, or get up to the church. They were able to get the grandparents. Route 29 is one of the bigger routes now, but it was one of the main thoroughfares in Nelson County at the time. It had 7 people in a Chevelle. The Chevelle is very important for the next part. The car stalled out in the middle of Route 29. Water all of a sudden is up to the top of the doors. Car did not move. Milton said every once in a while a wave would come over the hood of the car and rock the car, but the car never moved. The lightning was so vivid. This is how strong the dynamics were. And there were numerous reports of the lightning, sheet lightning, being so vivid. People were watching other things wash away in the distance. They could see trailers washing down the road. Everything washed away. Their car never moved. I told you the Chevelle was important. When they finally went back home, they had water in their basement, but the rest of the house was fine. Two similar stories with two very different outcomes. A lot of other people weren't so lucky. I would imagine some people were asleep, and when these debris flow happened, they didn't even know what hit, because that's how powerful some of these debris flows were. And it happened in the middle of the night. 2 tractor trailers completely disappeared from the face of the earth. They never found it. It was buried in mud. There were 30 to 50 feet of mud coming out of some of these mountains. As I mentioned earlier, about 1% of Nelson County's population died that night. And this is not even in addition to the river flooding that it led to in the James River Basin toward the Richmond and Lynchburg areas. These are some pictures. There's over 133 bridges wiped out. So the rain happened so fast, so heavy, that it wiped out all communication very quickly before people even realized what was really happening. And a lot of people, when this happened late at night, okay, it's a bad thunderstorm, it's raining really heavy, I'll go to bed. And as they were woken up in the middle of the night, you woke up to no electricity, no telephone, no communication. There's no weather radios back then. There's no way to get alerts. There's no 911 back then. Even if you did have a warning process, how are you going to alert these people back then? This is in the middle of the night. So the warning process, there wasn't any warning process. The forecast was for the storm to actually go to the northwest, but because that cold front came in, it pushed Camille straight down into Virginia. So the forecast was for showers with some clearing in the morning. There was only one heavy rainfall report received by DC. So DC had no idea that this was even ongoing because they couldn't see from the radar and they couldn't get the reports in. Because even though we had 3 river gauges, we had hundreds of creeks, but everything was manual. So at 3:39 in the morning, this is probably after 25 inches of rain has already fallen. They're finally getting word from West Virginia, from Clifton Forge, West Virginia, which is about 60 miles west of Nelson County, that they had about 8 to 9 inches. And there was some flooding being reported in Nelson and Amherst counties, which is near the Lynchburg areas. At this point, no one has any idea of the amount of destruction, rain, or state of the county in Nelson County. So the first statement put out by DC was at 3:39 in the morning. And once they started getting the information, now they could make the river forecast. And the river forecasts were actually not bad once they could get the information. We couldn't get the information because the rain happened so fast and so heavy. By the time anyone realized what was happening in the middle of the night, it took out all of that communication. According to the Virginia Department of Emergency Management, their biggest threat before 1969's Camille was protecting Virginians from the threats of an atomic bomb. I remind you that Virginia is on a coastline. Virginia was a huge, huge turning point. Virginia did not even have a state emergency operations plan. Again, we are on a coastline. So in 1971, the Commonwealth declared its first natural disaster plan. This was huge. This was huge for the state. We had to teach people how to become prepared. Communities developed recovery plans, response plans. And because of what happened in Camille, it later helped create the Disaster Relief Act of 1974, which is still kind of in part today, or still part of it exists today. So some of the state of the reporting system for river gauges in 1969, there were 3 stream gauges in Nelson County, but they were all manual, and it was done by telephone. When the network goes out, what are you going to do? So in the 1970s, the flood warning network was installed, which later becomes iFlows. And they increased river gauges in flood-prone areas. According to the USGS, storms in Virginia produce debris flow about every 15 years. Well, think back 20 years previous, we had the big 1949 flood. About 15 years after Camille, we had 1985, the remnants of Hurricane Juan met up with a cold front along West Virginia and the Virginia state line again, produced heavy rainfall over an extended period of time, and it led to numerous debris flows. And the problem with 1985 was because of all the gaps in the mountains, it would create a natural dam. And that dam would build up and build up and build up, and then when the power of the water became so strong, it broke through. And then it created just a disaster. So 1985 was actually another similar event to Camille. This is the current radar coverage map. Where that blue spot is in Virginia, that's where Nelson County is now. We've come a long way with radar coverage, but poor Nelson County, that's basically my radar coverage area. There's a lot of beam blockage going on. My radar beam hits usually about 6,000 to 8,000 feet. But there were improvements made in the radar network. This is Nelson County today. Population is about 15,000 in the 2010 census. It is a big spot for Virginia tourism now. Wintergreen Ski Resort is there. Now it's an alcoholics paradise. There's 12 wineries, 6 breweries, 2 cideries, and a distillery. It has come a long, long way. But Hurricane Camille shaped Nelson County. Hurricane Camille devastated Nelson County, but it is the county it is today, and it actually shaped a lot of why Virginia has a lot of its emergency management plans, why we have a lot of our plans. Why it took until 1969, I'm not sure, but I think it was a big wake-up call for a lot of us, and we've been learning from weather history over the years. There's another cool story from Virginia about how a new species of apples was discovered out of Hurricane Camille. A lot of part of the Shenandoah Valley is actually a big apple producer in the state, and a lot of the apple orchards were wiped away by the debris flows and the flooding. And in this one gentleman's orchard, a lot of his trees were decimated, and he saw this one tree in the back that had a different color apple. And when he went over to it, it tasted different, and it was some new hybrid that he did not plant that somehow stemmed from something coming together, and it's called, I think it's called the Virginia Golden Ginger Gold, and it was a new species of apple. It's kind of a weird story that they discovered this new apple coming out of Hurricane Camille. The pictures are incredible, and the river flooding from Hurricane Camille. The river flooding actually went down into Richmond and the James River Basin and led to some historic crests. And we have a lot of river crest information from the James River Basin going back to like the 17 and late 1600s, think early settlement years. And Camille's crest was one of, I think, the top 2 in Virginia's history for the James River Basin. A lot of people were caught off guard by this storm, but you have to think, what could we have done when you have a storm like this in the middle of the night in 1969? The only thing that would have saved more people, possibly, is if this had happened during the daytime. Because a lot of people in Nelson County, and even still today, commute and go to jobs outside the county. There's not a lot of jobs inside the county. So a lot of people would not have been home at the time. Maybe there would have been some more people on the roads, but a lot of people would not have been in their homes in the middle of the day had this happened in the middle of the day. Unfortunately, this did happen in the middle of the night. The debris flow problem in Virginia is one that the National Weather Service offices have been continuing to work on and educating Virginians. We also had a really bad one in Madison County, which is about 2 or 3 counties north of Nelson County in 1996, especially with the eastern slope component. So we know that these happen, especially when we have our remnant tropical systems. And when they tend to meet up, I actually met a gentleman about a week and a half ago, and he was telling me how he moved to the Shenandoah Valley from Norfolk. And he said he moved in 1996. I said, oh, the year of the flood. And he kind of did a double take. He said, yeah, we moved in August. I said, you moved right before the flood. And he was thoroughly impressed that I knew exactly the year of the flood. And then he proceeded to tell me his story about how they went through the flood of 1996. You're building relationships with your community. People are more likely to trust you with this information. And you can use this information. During the 1996 event, or during last year, I should say, during the 2018 floods, I would use 1996 as a big comparison because that was kind of our comparable year. And you can use those events and compare. You know, many of you remember the flood of 1996. Well, this is the last time this river crested. This is the last time we saw something like this bad. Or I have fears, you know, about this year. We've had a lot of moisture, and that's similar to 1996. Many of you remember that. Now's the time to be prepared. So Hurricane Camille was a huge turning point for the state of Virginia. This year, as I mentioned, is the 5th, I hate to use the word anniversary for a big weather disaster. Anniversary is supposed to be a good time. So this year marks 50 years since Hurricane Camille. The Historical Society in Nelson County is already planning on doing a number of events, as they usually do every year, memorializing and bringing the community together to talk about Hurricane Camille. Some people think it's a little too much. I think a lot of the people who lost family members, a lot of the people who lost ones that they loved, they might not want to hear it anymore. But I think it's still an important part of the community's history. And here's the other problem now, is we have so many people that have moved into our community that don't know the history of Hurricane Camille. They don't know what's happened to the mountainsides before. We live about, the Shenandoah Valley is about 80 to 100 miles from the coastline. But boy, do we get remnant tropical storms. Boy, do we get remnant hurricanes. And that moisture will feed into the Appalachian Mountains. So it's educating the public that even though we don't live on a coastline, remnant tropical systems are one of our most susceptible events to the Shenandoah Valley. And this is something that we need to be prepared for. And it's showing them those videos, showing them the videos of what's happened in the past, showing them some of the damaging and destructive flooding events that's happened in the past that we need to learn from, that we need to be aware of, that we need to prepare for. We've certainly seen it with 2018, and it's kind of been concerning, continuing a lot of moisture going into 2019. So we're hoping to break that pattern, because the fear is if we continue to see a lot of this moisture, you know, we're going to have even more flooding. That's all I have. Thank you.